As Chris said, my name is Donna Rosenbaum, and I am the chair of the Far Hill Speaker Series on the Historical Society side of all of this. Just real quickly, an announcement to mark your calendars for the upcoming two remaining speaker series of the spring. On March the 19th, Mark Risley is going to talk about the classic architecture of Oakwood. If you haven't heard the presentation 5 or 6 years ago when he gave it, it's really very interesting. Talks about all the different architectural styles here in Oakwood, and especially for new residents who aren't aware of the variety of styles, it's really a lot of fun. And then I think my favorite for the spring, sorry guys, is on April the 16th, we're going to have the Garden Club of Dayton come, and they'll be talking about all things garden. They'll be talking about the historical gardens here in Oakwood and how they were laid out and planned, and we'll run the gamut to now the natural plantings that we do for bees and hummingbirds and all of that. So mark your calendars for that one. So got the holding all the questions till the end, buy the books at the end, and Martin will autograph the book, of course, if you purchase it. So now why we're here, the real reason is we're going to be hearing today about this amazing character from Dayton, Ohio, that I had never even heard of until Martin wrote this book, Clement Vallandigham. And as Martin shares the story of Clement in the book, I learned so much about the Civil War, about the city of Dayton, about the nation, about the North and the South, all of the issues running the gamut from about 1850 to 1870 or so. So I think you're in for a real treat as he walks through all of this immense research that he's done on Clement Vallandigham. So who is this man who's written this wonderful book for us? It's Martin Gottlieb, and if you're not familiar with him, you should be, because you've probably seen his name in the Dayton Daily News for almost 30 years. He was an editorial writer, and his editorial made it to the point where it was syndicated in the New York Times as well. So he's very, very accomplished as a journalist. And so in honor of President's Day, I'm not going to belabor this anymore. I'd like to introduce Martin Gottlieb to talk to us about Clement Vallandigham.
Well, thank you very much, Donna, for putting this together, for organizing it, and most of all, for inviting me. I'm honored by that, and I'm honored by your presence. Appreciate all the work you did in getting the word out about this. This turnout is terrific from my standpoint. I don't even want to tell you what kind of turnout I've gotten at some places. This is excellent. And I'd like to thank the library too for hosting us and handling the electronic aspects of this. Chris Leininger and Elizabeth Schmidt and Tom Morrill. I appreciate that. And also whoever did the posters. Well, I do like to talk about my book, and I hope that you enjoy this and find it worthwhile and find it engaging when we get to Q&A. I think that I need to keep the questions to the end, because I think interruptions might cause me to lose my place. I'm not dealing with notes here, so interruptions might be a problem. So I worked for the Dayton Daily News for 27 years, and in that capacity, and my job was very largely about politics and meeting political people of various kinds all the time. And in those 27 years, I think that I heard the name Clement Vallandigham maybe 3 or 4 times. Very, very rarely. And but I eventually recognized another pattern, which was that I never heard the name of any other historical congressman from Dayton. Couldn't have named any. And I thought, well, if this is the only guy whose name lives on at all, I really ought to know something about him, just by virtue of my job, writing political columns for the local paper. So I looked into them, and after doing that, and after letting it sort of seep through my brain for some months, I finally realized, boy, this is just really a juicy story. It's just fun, it's surprising, it's important, it's utterly unique in some very important ways in American history. It's cinematic. and it is almost completely unknown. So after a while, I was just sort of a journalist sitting on this story. I felt obliged to tell it. And so see if you find it that compelling. Let me start here. With all due respect to the people after whom this library is named, the Wright brothers did not put Dayton on the map. Clement Vallandigham had taken care of that several decades earlier. This is what Dayton was in the national consciousness, the home of Clement Vallandigham for a long time. If you were a Daytonian in, say, the mid-1880s, and you were traveling elsewhere in the country, and you mentioned that you were from Dayton. Now, this is 15 years after Vallandigham's death in middle age. The first word on anybody's lips, any place, would have been Vallandigham. And if you said Dayton, people thought Vallandigham. If you said Vallandigham, people thought Dayton. By far the most prominent Daytonian of the 19th century, but that understates his fame. Now, why was he so famous for so long? Well, that's a list, and it's a remarkable list. It's not a list of accomplishment. And it has to start here. He was President Abraham Lincoln's leading antagonist in the North. Isn't it remarkable that we don't already know who that person was, who filled that slot, given that people in this room would know many other names associated with the Civil War era? Well, the reason we don't know his name is not that Lincoln's opponents in the North are not terribly important. They were terribly important. They were on his mind all the time, as we'll see. I'm talking about the people who opposed the whole idea of war with the South, who blamed the war on the Northern Republican Party and its opposition to slavery. The Republican Party was new in the 1850s, and the main idea associated with it was opposition to the extension of slavery into the new states that were manifestly in the offing in the West. It wasn't about abolishing slavery in the South. It was about whose system would prevail in the new states. And Vallandigham's view was that Lincoln's and the Republicans' hostility toward slavery in that sense had driven the South out of the country. And his solution to the country's problems was always that movement should shut up, should dry up, just go away. That would bring the country back together with slavery. His movement was a very potent one. It was one of the two wings of the Democratic Party. The other wing was called the War Democrats. The War Democrats did not favor a war to free the slaves. But once the war started because of secession, which happened because of Lincoln's election, they recognized that the only way to put the country back together was to win the war, which the Copperheads denied. The Copperheads was the name given to Vallandigham's movement for reasons we could get into. They called themselves the Peace Democrats. Lincoln is quoted as saying in January of 1863, at a time when the war was not going well for the North, he said, "I'm not worried about whether we can win this war with the South. We can defeat the South in the war. My great concern is the fire in the rear." That could have been the title of my book. And it was a reference to the Copperheads and to Vallandigham. And to extend his metaphor about fire, the great arsonist was the congressman from Dayton, Ohio. Lincoln could imagine that fire taking the form of an independence movement in the West to get away from the North, the Northeast, and New England, because that was really the hotbed of the anti-slavery movement, not the West. But even short of that, the Copperheads would be running for office against the war, agitating against it, undercutting people's commitment to the war and to, getting them to volunteer for the war. Vallandigham comes to national prominence about the same time as Lincoln comes to power. 1860. And one of the reasons is that he's a remarkable orator. He has studied speech making from childhood with the goal of being a politician. That leads me to some of my illustrations. Let me start with this one. Sorry for the fuzziness, but I just wanted to, this has nothing to do with the point I was just making, but I just want to highlight the name and to note that there is no ing. It's remarkable how likely people are to put an ing in there. As to the pronunciation, if you want to say go phonetic, Vallandigham, I think that's fine. I think back in the day that the most common pronunciation entailed swallowing the last syllable, swallow the ham, Vallandigham. And I think that's the habit I'm in. Well, this is the house he grew up in. It's still extant. When I first started looking into this an embarrassing number of years ago, it was for sale. It was listed online at $229. It's in Lisbon, Ohio. Back in Vallandigham's day, known as New Lisbon. It's on the Pennsylvania border, a couple of counties north of I-70. Vallandigham's father was the Presbyterian minister in town, having been sent there by the church, having grown up in Western Pennsylvania. New Lisbon was one of the first couple of towns in Ohio. It is said that in this house, Vallandigham's father presided over the wedding of future President William McKinley's grandparents. Well, he brought young boys into the house for schooling, and that's where Vallandigham was schooled, in his father's house. I believe he showed a talent for oratory early on and was off. At a very early age, looking about like that, maybe 20, having been through college, he starts volunteering to speak at Democratic Party events around New Lisbon, having grown up as a Jacksonian Democrat. And he gets on the programs and he just blows people away with his oratorical skills. I say, look at that kid go. And so he got slated for the state legislature, very early 20s, and elected as a Democrat to the State House of Representatives. And he got reelected. Then he moved to Dayton. And this was a young man going west. He had always identified with the West, but the definition of it was changed. When he was born in 1820, anything in Ohio. By 1840, not so much. Dayton was a coming place, had a fair amount going for it. The canals were in, the rivers were useful, the trains were coming through all the time. The National Road was going through Vandalia, taking people west. And it was apparently a fairly pretty town. A lot of people liked the big wide streets downtown. Vallandigham got recruited for the job of editor of the local Democratic newspaper, the Western Empire, a weekly, soon to become a daily. Now, there was really no distinction in those days between newspaper work and political work. The same guys kept going back and forth between the two. And Vallandigham was going to use this job as a stepping stone to elective office, which is all he ever really wanted professionally. He's a lawyer by now, having studied under his brother in New Lisbon. And so he runs for judge in Dayton, and he runs and he loses, and he runs again for judge and he loses. He runs for the Democratic nomination for Secretary of State and he loses. I think he thought he had some name recognition in the two corners of the state, which might have been one reason he picked Dayton in the first place. But he lost that. We get to the 50s, he's 30 years old, he's running for Congress, and he loses, and he runs for Congress again, and he loses. But finally, by the end of the 50s, he's in Congress by the skin of his teeth as a result of a very hotly contested election outcome, where the issue was, could Black people and mixed race people vote? He took the negative position on that. It got really ugly. And that got him some national attention, but he was declared the winner of the race. Also getting him national attention was this, and this is the main thing. When the Civil War broke out in mid-April 1861. There was a tremendous rallying around Lincoln and a rallying around the cause of war. Because there was tremendous fury all across the North, at the South, for firing upon American troops off the coast of South Carolina for the purpose of defending South Carolina against foreign invasion. Great outrage. So it's a 9/11 type movement. It's a Pearl Harbor type movement. It doesn't last long. And when it dissipates, that consensus behind Lincoln and war, Vallandigham gets credit from the other Copperheads for never having participated in it. He had always been relentlessly, uncompromisingly critical of Lincoln and criticized Lincoln for everything he did and emphasized the word every himself. He was mad at him for going to war. He said, before Sumter, Lincoln was talking peace. Now all of a sudden he's fighting a war. He was mad at him for raising troops without the participation of Congress, which wasn't in session and typically wasn't in session in those years. He's mad at him for raising money without Congress. And he says that don't pay any attention to these people who tell you that this is a war to preserve the Union. He says they don't care about the Union, the Republicans and Lincoln. If they cared about the Union, they would drop this anti-slavery clause. That's what's destroying the Union. So Vallandigham becomes the major national spokesman for that point of view, the most widely quoted, the most charismatic, the most attention-getting, the most relentless. He's the guy. If you read the newspapers in the North after Sumter, you see the Republican papers denouncing the people who are against the war as traitors, and they use the plural word people, but when they get to talking about who they're actually talking about, it's Vallandigham and nobody else, again and again and again, sometimes in multiple articles in the same newspaper. He's big, and he's a hero to the Copperheads. Valiant Val, speaking truth to power, standing up to the man, all that. As a result of being that guy, he gets targeted by the Republicans for defeat in the 1862 midterm election. They really want to beat Vallandigham. And they do two things. They, with the help of Lincoln, they find an exceptionally strong candidate to run against him, a friend of Lincoln, Robert Skank, who is somehow related to Skank Avenue in Oakwood. Well, I could get into that, but it's not him. And he's an injured war veteran, man Lincoln's age, who was fighting the war. And they redraw Vallandigham's district. I thought I'd get into that since that's something we still argue about these days. Vallandigham's original district was 3 counties in their entirety and nothing else. In those days, districts were drawn along county lines. You can't do that anymore because the Supreme Court has ruled that districts must be very, very, very close to each other in total population. You can't get there if you're going to observe county lines rigidly. But he had 3: Montgomery County, Preble County, and Butler County. That district leaned a little bit Democratic, and Lincoln had lost it marginally in 1860 while carrying Montgomery County marginally. After the 1860 census, Ohio was going to lose 2 seats in the House of Representatives because people were becoming concerned that as the country grew in population and territory, the House of Representatives would become unwieldy to many people. So they enlarged the size of districts as to population. So that meant Ohio lost 2 districts. That meant that many of the remaining districts had to have a county added to them. So the Republicans running the process added Warren County to the district. So now it's basically, the district is basically a square, or as close to a square as you can get in observed county lines. And that's not the usual definition of gerrymandering, drawing lines to suit one party. But it did help the Republicans, and they knew what they were doing. Warren County leaned a little bit Republican. One reason for that was that there were a fair number of Quakers up from the South in opposition to slavery, running the Underground Railroad, as you may have heard, and they were Republicans. So adding Warren County changed the district into one that Lincoln would have carried in 1860. And what happened in the 62 midterm was Vallandigham lost his reelection bid while carrying his old district. And he carried his old district by a little bit more than he ever had before, though still quite marginally. So now he's a national figure who has lost a local election. He's not going to quit. Ohio elects its governors in every odd numbered year. He's going to run for governor in 1863. And he's going to spin his defeat as a moral victory because they only got me because they redrew the lines, played games with the lines. And they only came after me because I was their most effective opponent, which was true. So he's got a strong body of support, but he is not expected to win the nomination. There's another guy who has run statewide before. He's sort of in line. He's more moderate. Before launching his campaign for governor, Vallandigham makes his last speech in Congress as a lame duck, January of 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation has just gone into formal effect. This is the speech in which Vallandigham declares himself flatly pro-slavery. He had not done that before. He'd been accused of being pro-slavery, denied it. Now he is embracing it. I want to emphasize the point because if you hear his name around town, which hasn't been that likely, or even see it online or see it even between hardcovers, you might get the impression he wasn't really pro-slavery. He was just pro-states' rights on principle. This is factually wrong. He was explicitly, argumentatively, proudly pro-slavery during the war. I don't say he was that way all his life. He evolved in that direction. And I was fascinated by that. How does that happen to a Northerner in those years? Throughout his entire adult life, he's being bombarded with the case against slavery. He hears the case, rejects it, moves in the other direction. How does that happen? Well, I delve into it and I come up with a theory that I think will resonate with modern readers and that I think is right. I'd rather not go into it. I've had to make some decisions about what I can get into and what I can't. And, I wouldn't object if some people actually want to read the book. So now he's off and running for governor. Well, this is the point at which this story becomes so remarkable to me, so juicy, surprising, so important, so utterly unique in some very important ways in American history, and utterly cinematic. In that everything that happens now seems to come right out of a movie, starting with Vallandigham's arrest. He was arrested for his views by the US Army in the middle of the war, running for governor of Ohio. This is the fellow who ordered the arrest, General Ambrose Burnside, the historic sideburns. He's in Cincinnati. He's in charge of the army in this part of the country. I would describe the part as what we call the Midwest and Kentucky. He's not in charge of the area. He's in charge of the army in the area. Nobody has declared martial law, putting him in charge. The regular civilian authorities are still in charge, but this point seems to be lost on him. And he issues an order known as General Orders number 38, which has a lot of provisions. One of them is expressions of sympathy for the enemy will no longer be tolerated in this department. Now, he's not acting in a vacuum. In other parts of the North and in border states, people are being arrested for similar charges. So Vallandigham is planning to give a speech in Mount Vernon, Ohio, north of Columbus. And he goes ahead and he takes on Burnside. He says, I don't take my orders from General Orders number 38. I take them from General Order number 1, the US Constitution. And then he's talking about free speech, and he can't turn a phrase. But about the war, he says, we can't win this war. It's too big a territory to conquer, too many people, can't do it, can't be done. He says, the war's being fought under false pretenses. It's not about saving the Union. He says it could be negotiated away. France is willing to mediate. Lincoln won't talk. And he says, and this is his theme always, it's being fought to establish a monarchy. Sometimes he says tyranny or despotism. It is about vastly increasing the power of the federal government and the Republican Party. And he points to the enactment just that year of the first national military draft in the history of the country. And he says, this shows you that power has gone to the heads of the Republicans. Now we have this hated institution that we associate with the dictatorships of Europe. And it's just the beginning. Well, it's a continuation of their despotism. He does not say about the war, the South is right and we're wrong. He doesn't say the South has the right to secede. He doesn't say, I hope they win. Draws a line at that kind of stuff. Nevertheless, Burnside orders his arrest. Sends troops up from Cincinnati on the train overnight, just a couple of days after his speech. They get off at the south end of downtown Dayton. They walk up Ludlow or Main Street toward Vallandigham's house, which at that point is on First Street between Ludlow and Wilkinson. It's on the north side of the street. Now that lot is an empty, is a flat parking lot. The Army takes a position outside the house. This is the house. Vallandigham comes to a front window in the second floor, and he is apparently trying to draw a crowd to complicate the Army's life. And he makes a weird noise designed to do that. That failed. And then he engages the major in charge in a debate. He says, you can't arrest me. I'm a civilian. The Army can't arrest civilians. Nobody put you in charge. A pretty good legal point. And he says, anyway, I was just exercising my free speech rights. Another pretty good legal point. But the major is not there to debate. He has his orders. They try to ram down the front doors of the house. They fail at that. Those doors still exist. Dayton history has them. They're not on display. The Army goes around to the back, gets in that way. Ultimately corners Vallandigham upstairs in one of the front bedrooms with his wife and sister. This is an attempt to capture that scene, although the women aren't in it. And it appears on the front page of a publication called Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper, national publication. Anybody who gets deeply into Civil War stuff keeps coming across that publication. So this is big news. It's going all across the country. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's editorializing about it at a time when editorials are right near the center of American political discourse. The war is raging. First week of May, '63, Battle of Chancellorsville. Hugely important battle in the history of the war, and sometimes seen as the low point in the war for the North. But Vallandigham is getting a lot of ink too. So they arrest him. They take him down to Cincinnati. Next day, Dayton burns. Slight exaggeration, but there's a big fire. So we've had the cinematic arrest scene. Now we have the fire. the angry Democrats that Vallandigham hoped would show up the night before now show up at the Copperhead newspaper, Democratic newspaper of the Empire. This was like going to party headquarters. And it's on Main Street, south of 3rd Street, south of Courthouse Square. They start throwing things across the street and up the block closer to the square at the Republican newspaper, the Dayton Daily Journal. The Journal burns down, and some buildings around it burn. This painting, done many years later, I think, involves the artist telling us that he understands that fire didn't start spontaneously, it has something to do with these people down at the foreground of the painting. The army comes back up from Cincinnati, having just been here the night before. Now they impose martial law, just in Dayton, for a few months. They shut down the Empire. They found an arsenal at the Empire. They found a couple hundred rifles and a swiveling cannon. And this fed the notion abroad in, especially in Republican circles, that the Copperheads were planning some sort of insurrection. But in fact, the Copperheads also had defensive reasons for wanting to be armed. Union troops on leave and drunk were assaulting Copperhead newspapers in Ohio and leveling some of them. The troops hated the Copperheads. They didn't hate all the Democrats, but it's a good generalization that they hated the Copperheads. So, see, I lost my place. Troops hated the Copperheads. So they impose martial law. They take Vallandigham down to Cincinnati. I said that already. So the fire, all right. So after the fire, the next day we're down in Cincinnati, and no, after the fire, the whole issue goes to Lincoln and his cabinet. As I said, other people are being arrested on political grounds, but Vallandigham is by far the most prominent person arrested. And that trial is by far the most prominent trial. And that punishment would be by far the biggest punishment meted out for an offense like this. So everybody's talking about it. It goes to Lincoln and his cabinet. Many people in the cabinet don't like what Burnside is doing. They have free speech qualms about putting Vallandigham in jail. And they think that Burnside is making a martyr out of Vallandigham. Here's a guy who just lost his reelection bid, and now he's bigger than ever. Burnside has one defender in the cabinet, and that's the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who's the one in Burnside's chain of command. Stanton knows that Burnside is not going rogue here when he arrests Vallandigham. He's doing something he thought the White House wanted. But the cabinet in majority doesn't want to send Vallandigham to prison. And so Lincoln decides to instead send him to the South, banish him to the South. This is an idea that is just in the air. These people like the South so much, send them to their friends. Maybe they'll be happier there. It's hardly a punishment at all. And maybe this will prevent Vallandigham from becoming a martyr. Now, I said earlier, there are a couple of utterly unique things that happen here, unique in all of American political history. Well, this is the first one I would highlight. Since when does a president of the United States get to throw his leading antagonist, his leading political antagonist out of the country. Never happened before or since, obviously. The fact that it was Lincoln added all manner of interest for me as I was looking into this. I am a conventional Lincoln admirer, but this happened. Problem?
No, I apologize for interrupting. Your mic went out. It's
Oh.
kind of hard to, I don't know if the battery went dead on me. I do apologize. I was just trying to help.
No problem. Anytime.
Yeah, it's not.
Okay, I apologize. I couldn't hear you in the back.
Shall I start over? So now you can say that Lincoln lowered the sentence from imprisonment to let me back up. Burnside wanted to sentence Vallandigham to the duration of the war in prison on the East Coast so that he wouldn't draw vigils around here. So you can say that Lincoln lowered the sentence, but in fact, Lincoln could have shot down the whole idea of punishing Vallandigham. He did this with generals when he thought that they were getting too much into politics as opposed to war. He didn't like to do it, but in this case, he made the case very aggressively, very publicly, at great length, in a kind of a new way of presidential communication that everybody heard, that Vallandigham had to go. He said, this guy is interfering with my efforts to man the army, to get people to volunteer, to get people to obey the draft, to get people to not desert. This is a war from which it is very easy to desert, or relatively easy. You just start walking home. You're not in Europe, you're not in Vietnam, and a couple of 100,000 guys on each side took that option during the war, and those are strategically important numbers. So Lincoln says, look, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to shoot? Now, keep in mind, desertion is a capital offense. Am I supposed to shoot the young troop who goes home to his family that needs him? He might have said the thousands of young troops who do that, and not touch a hair on the head of the wily agitator who encourages him to do that. Not touch a hair on the head of the wily agitator is a direct quote. And wily agitator might have been the name of my book. So Lincoln makes his decision. The next day, we're back in Cincinnati at the dock, and they're loading Vallandigham onto a boat down the Ohio to Louisville, under an armed guard, of course, because this is the order, send them south and do it now. And they get to Louisville and they put him on a train going east to this point in Tennessee. Between those two towns in bold is where the two armies, the two main armies of the West, are facing off against each other. Of the West, as opposed to the armies in Virginia, Robert E. Lee and all that. And they're not fighting at the moment. They have been, and they will be terrible, cataclysmic, historic battles. They take Vallandigham to Murfreesboro to meet the top general there. His name is Rosecrans. He's a very, very big name. He's being talked about for the presidency, and he's particularly big in Ohio. And he loathes copperheads. But he apparently finds, to his surprise, Vallandigham is a fairly charming guy. So another movie scene. But they got to get this done tonight. That's the order. So after that conversation, after midnight, they set out on this retinue going south. There's no playbook for this. There's no standard operating procedure. They don't know what to do except to just start going south. And so they've got some guys on horseback, and they got Vallandigham in a carriage, and they just set out. They get tired, and about 4 o'clock in the morning, I think, they come upon a certain farmhouse and decide to stop for a rest. And they're not expected, but they're greeted hospitably, perhaps because they're armed. But the lady of the house is utterly starstruck to have Vallandigham in her house. The great Vallandigham. She can't believe this. This is just the coolest thing that has ever happened. If they had selfies, I'd have a picture of her and him in my book. So they get breakfast there. Sun starts coming up. They get back on the road. They start going south. There's no hard and fast dividing line between the northern and southern armies. It's in there someplace. And at a certain stage, this retinue spies off in the distance a southern sentry alone. And the two top guys with the Union group say to the others, hang back, we're going to go talk to him. And they approach him under a white flag. Well, this is another movie scene that I love, because this guy is totally blindsided. He has no idea anything remotely like this could happen. They tell him who that is there, and he recognizes the name, but he does not have a clue how to handle this. He understands this is not war, this is politics, and it's above his pay grade. And so all he can think of to do is to send back to headquarters for orders. Well, the top general back there in Shelbyville is Braxton Bragg, as in Fort Bragg. But he's not around. And nobody else is going to make this political decision. So the guys with Vallandigham are just kind of hanging around, killing time. And finally, the two top officers say to each other, you know, we can't go back with him. Our orders are to come back without him. Maybe we just leave. And so that's what they did. They just said, we're leaving now, goodbye. And now the Confederacy has Vallandigham, ready or not. At this stage, Vallandigham declares himself a prisoner of war. In a set speech, he has thought hard about what he wants to say upon this moment of transfer. POW makes no sense. He's not that. They haven't captured him. They're not trying to hold him. But what is he? He's not a refugee. He's not fleeing there, being deposited there. And there's a political problem. There's an appearance problem here. It's one thing to, there's a war on. It's one thing to oppose the policy of the war, and another to be seen cozying up to the enemy. He can't be seen accepting Southern hospitality, a term that the Southerners actually used in deciding how to handle the fact that Vallandigham had arrived. Vallandigham's got to get out of the South for political reasons. And the authorities don't want him there, although that's complicated. He is, without any question, the South's favorite Yankee. Could have been the title of my book too. And he's the favorite of the people, as exemplified by the lady at the courthouse, farmhouse. And he's the favorite of the authorities, Confederate authorities, far and away. But there's a problem. He has to give lip service to, and I think he really favors, ultimate reunification of North and South with slavery. He has to favor reunification. Just letting the South go is a fringe position in the North. You can't take that position. But reunification is poison to the Confederate authorities. Way out of the question. No, no, no. We have declared our independence. That's done. Think July 5th, 1776. We're gone. Thousands of our men have died in enforcing that decision. We're going to make good on that decision. And we don't even want to be seen talking to anybody who has a different point of view, lest that give the wrong impression. So they don't invite him to Richmond to talk to President Jefferson Davis or anybody near that rank. But they do want to talk to him. They do want to pick his brain. They want to see if he has anything he wants to say to them. They want to see if he's a traitor, the way he's being portrayed in much of the North. So they have a mid-level official talk to him. The conversation happens in Lynchburg. And this guy is in charge of POW exchanges with the North. Those exchanges are happening periodically. So the Southern authorities have bought into this whole POW thing because they don't have any vocabulary for what this really is. Well, in that conversation, Vallandigham is quoted secondhand as saying something that I have no hesitation about calling flatly treasonous. But we don't know for sure that he said it, and I would like to leave it up to readers to decide how likely they think it is that he actually said it under those circumstances. He wants to get to Canada, and the Confederate authorities are eager to help him. This cartoon appears in the North. The guy who is not Lincoln is Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, batting Vallandigham back and forth. Neither wants Vallandigham. And that's a pretty accurate description of the situation. So to help him get to Canada, the Confederate authorities help him get to Wilmington, North Carolina, because the Union Navy has imposed a blockade on all southern ports to prevent trade, but the one at Wilmington doesn't work very well for reasons having to do with the geography of Wilmington. So they're thinking that maybe here he can catch some sort of cargo vessel that'll at least get him started on his trip to Canada. So now he's just waiting for a ship to come in. They're not on any schedule. They come when they come. They have to run the blockade to get in. He's there 7 to 10 days, end of June, 1963. This is where he is when he learns that he has been nominated by the Democrats for governor of Ohio. As I said, he was not expected to win that nomination, but the arrest changed everything, turned him into a martyr overnight, a hero to the Democratic base. Movie scene, tens of thousands of people descend upon Columbus for the Democratic State Convention, insisting upon the nomination of Vallandigham for governor. All opposition dissipates. One gets the impression that the delegates were just simply afraid, physically afraid, not to nominate Vallandigham for governor. So they nominated him all but unanimously. Now, I said there are things happening here that are utterly unique in American political history. This is the second one I would highlight. The Democratic candidate for governor may not enter the state or the country during the campaign to express his views precisely because of those views. Utterly unprecedented in all of American history. So Vallandigham gets word that he's been nominated when he's in Wilmington. I don't think he was shocked. He knew the martyrdom value of his arrest. But he gets almost no information about it. It would have come in 1 or 2 lines in a Confederate newspaper, and they were really, really struggling by then. So he doesn't know how it went down. Was it close? Who was for him? Who was against him? Was it violent? What's the aftermath? How's it playing? Is the party sticking together? Nobody in Ohio knows where he is. Nobody in his life knows where he is. But this is the big moment of his life, right? He's thrown out of the country by the president and then nominated for governor of the 3rd largest state. This is big. He's got nobody to celebrate with. He's just sitting by the dock of the bay wasting time. Another movie scene. So he gets to Canada. He's an international celebrity. He's interviewed by the British press. He's invited to Parliament. He goes to Parliament. He's talked about in all of the editorials, pro and con. He's getting an enormous amount of attention, more than he really needs, because he needs to focus on his campaign. I have to leave out a lot here, but he gets to Windsor. across the river from Detroit. Windsor is approximately nothing then, but it does have this inn looking out over the river at Detroit and looking out over at a Union naval vessel present in Vallandigham's honor. They know exactly where he is all the time. They've been tracing his movements. He's going to run the campaign from that inn in Windsor. He's going to be issuing letters to be read in his name at his rallies in Ohio. Now, picture the drama of that. This is what they don't want you to hear, right? These people have had the nerve to throw our guy out of the country because they don't want you to hear what he has to say. Here's what he has to say. The campaign was huge. It suffused everything in Ohio, any place you were on any given day. There'd be something big happening in the campaign. A parade in a place like Dayton would go on for a couple of hours. A rally in Dayton or any place else would be likely to draw, and these are carnival-like events, they'd be likely to draw more people than lived in the county because people came from counties around. And by all accounts, the Democratic events were bigger, juicier, livelier, more enthusiastic than the Republican ones. But everybody got that this was history. Turnout in that election was greater than the turnout in either presidential elections surrounding it in Ohio. The two Lincoln victories, 60 and 64, were high turnout elections themselves, a little over 80% apparently of the eligible voters, the white guys. And this topped even that. Well, that doesn't happen. No, it didn't happen then. It doesn't happen now. It didn't come close to happening. And when it happened, it was a shock. And the losing side cried foul. They said, where'd all those votes come from? And their answer was Michigan and Pennsylvania and Indiana. And it wasn't true. Everybody had been on guard against that sort of thing. They knew how to run elections by then. Local elections officials knew the local voters. You couldn't just show up from Indiana and vote. And really everybody knew this, but they wanted to claim they were cheated, so they claimed they were cheated. At the beginning of that campaign, a lot of Democratic politicos thought that Vallandigham could win this election. I don't want to say everybody thought that, but there was a respected body of opinion. The Democrats were on a roll, it seemed. They had just had a good midterm. And there was great dissatisfaction with the fact that the war was still going on and was so bloody. And great concern that Lincoln just wasn't up to this and his generals just weren't up to it. And the Democrats thought they had a great bipartisan issue in free speech. And they thought they had the more charismatic candidate. He wasn't going to be allowed to enter the state, but they thought they could get something out of that too. However, early in the campaign, the military situation changed in favor of the North. It wasn't the last turning point in the war, but it was a big one. And we now know in retrospect that the better the Union was doing on the battlefield, the better the Republicans did in elections. And so now the political atmosphere is changing during the campaign in Ohio. And everybody could feel it changing. Vallandigham apparently felt it in Canada. And there was this. Political violence was in the air in Ohio. Things were happening and other things along those lines were being rumored to have happened. And I mentioned earlier the problems that the troops could cause when they were on leave and drunk. Concern arose that if Vallandigham won this election, he couldn't be inaugurated He couldn't get to Columbus safely, and he couldn't get inaugurated safely. In fact, that's what his opponent said. He said, I'm sorry, this just isn't going to happen. I don't care who wins. No, people are just wound too tight. Tensions are running too high. Not going to happen. Vallandingham's running mate spoke up and he said, not to worry, if it comes to that, I can raise an army of 50,000 men who will make sure that Vallandigham gets to Columbus safely and inaugurated safely. Well, now the people of Ohio have been told by both sides that if Vallandigham wins, they can expect something like civil war between Ohioans. I mean, 50,000 men, that probably didn't help Vallandigham in the election. He lost an overwhelming landslide. But the reason it was a overwhelming landslide was the troop vote. The troops voted against him more than 9-1. The civilian vote was probably about 55-45 against him. But he got enough votes to have won in a normal turnout. And I think that's what you have to understand to get a feel for just how polarized the North was. That many people voted for that guy who'd been thrown out of the country under those circumstances. Talk about polarization. I hate to think what would have happened in the North if the war had gone on a year longer than it did. I think the North is starting to come apart at the seams politically. Well, Lincoln was ecstatic about the outcome of the Vallandigham election. Over the moon. He said he worried more about that one than he had about his own election in 1860. He wired the Ohio Republicans after the victory. Glory be to God, Ohio has saved the nation. That's where Vallandigham and the Copperheads figured in Lincoln's consciousness. Now, this story takes a turn that surprised me as a lifelong political junkie. One might think that Vallandigham's stay at the center of national politics would be over now. Thrown out of the country under those circumstances, defeated so big, especially by the almost unanimous opposition of the troops, you would think he would be marginalized. No. He was just moving toward the center of national politics. He was in Canada for about a year, all told, about half of it coming after his defeat in October, mid-October. He didn't know whether if he came back, he'd be arrested. So he's staying there and he's he doesn't really have much to do. He's just sitting there thinking and brooding and planning. And one of his characteristics is that he's got a very fertile brain. He's always coming up with ideas. Many of them are half-baked, but ideas. And he's got an idea now, and he's got a plan, and he makes no small plans. His plan requires him to be a delegate to the Democratic National Convention of '64, scheduled for Chicago at the end of August. He's still in Canada. An effort is made to get the Democrat state convention in Ohio to send him to Chicago as a delegate. This is the same convention that a year before had made him its all but unanimous choice for governor. It declines to do that. There are elections, there are runoffs. It's a whole big thing. And 5 other guys are sent, and he doesn't make the cut. Times have changed. But he's got one other card to play. How short do you want to cut this?
Been an hour.
It's been an hour.
It's a wonderful story.
Oh, thank you. 10 more minutes?
These guys.
Let me try for that.
I think you got a thumbs up.
Thank you for that. So he's got this plan. So now He's rejected by the state party. He has one other card to play. The party in every congressional district gets to send a delegate to Chicago. And in the 3rd congressional district, Democratic Party, Vallandigham is a demigod. He was not that, he was never that in Dayton as a whole, the region, but within the party, demigod. So the party is holding its convention in Hamilton. He's still in Canada. Movie scene, they get him disguised, cape, wig, I think. They get him surrounded by 4 guys, spirited in the dark of night onto a boat across the river to Detroit, spirited onto a train going south. The train bypasses Dayton and his wife and child, goes on to Hamilton. He's not expected in Hamilton. When he gets to the train station, the word gets out. Bedlam, joy. This is American politics at its most ecstatic. Their hero is back. They can't believe it. They think it's a turning point in American history. And they are just thrilled that they can be part of it. And the celebration is prolonged. And they send him to Chicago as a delegate. Well, in Chicago, he's very big because this is a Copperhead-dominated convention. Despite his huge loss, very big, because he's still the Copperhead, the main guy. And they're going to nominate a non-Copperhead for president, the war Democrat, George McClellan, the general Lincoln fired. He's not a conquering hero of a general, but he's a general. And they think he's their best bet. They're going to saddle him with a Copperhead vice president, Congressman George Pendleton from Cincinnati. They're going to saddle him with a Copperhead platform. Vallandigham wrote the platform. This was the plan he came up with in Canada. He's going to get to Chicago. He's going to get on the platform committee. He's going to dominate the committee, which he did. He wrote the platform. It's short, about 500 words, all about the war. Its operative phrase is the experiment of war has resulted in 4 years of failure to bring the country back together. Experiment of war, failure. So now the Democrats are no longer, Democrats are on record as not pursuing victory in the war. The experiment of war having failed. Well, as the Democrats are leaving Chicago, General William Tecumseh Sherman and his troops are entering Atlanta, which has become a pivotal battle. So the war is no longer the pending stalemate that it was. It's now a pending victory. The week-old platform is obsolete. But even if it not for that, McClellan could not have embraced the platform. That word failure about something he had been so intimately involved with. Failure was the word that the Republicans used about McClellan's military record. That's why he was fired. He wasn't going to say failure. And a war Democrat could not accept giving up on winning the war. So he rejected the platform. And I don't mean a plank, the platform, another unique event in American history. Well, Vallandigham is apoplectic. It's his platform. And he's off sulking, and there's concern that he's going to not even endorse the ticket. And some Democrats say, fine, let's go without Vallandigham. But others say, no, we have to all be united, and Copperheads are important. So there's a peace powwow in Dayton, and he's back on the team. He has to be on the team to enact the rest of his plan from Canada. His plan, I'm convinced, is he is going to be President McClellan's negotiator with the South. He's going to be the one that ends this thing fast with reunification and with slavery. And he's going to do it by presenting the South with ironclad guarantees about the future of slavery in the South and the West, and an ironclad guarantee about its power to run its own affairs. He's going to rewrite the Constitution. He's going to make it more of a states' rights constitution. As I said, he's always got these ideas. This is one of them. He's had them for years. He's got these constitutional amendments written. So now's his chance. So he has to be on the team. Well, in the campaign, this poster appears. McClellan, Vallandigham, Secretary of War. Well, in fact, Vallandigham is not going to be Secretary of War. McClellan hates him. He's the author of that word failure. But that was just the last straw. He just loathes Vallandigham. This is not a Democratic poster. This is a Republican poster. This is the Republican saying, if you want McClellan, you're going to get Vallandigham. It's a scare tactic. And I suppose it's fair enough for politics because he is back on the team and he thinks he's going to be a major player in the McClellan administration. So as you know, he didn't get to play that role, that historic role. The end of the war and the outcome of the election eliminated him from, well, as a result, he was no longer at the center of national politics for a while. He spends the last half of the 1860s failing to get reelected to something. 1871, he's only 51 years old. One of his ideas has caught on, it's caught fire. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's editorializing about it. He's getting positive editorials out of Republican newspapers, which is a new experience for him. But the point is, he's back, and it looks like he might be finally getting a shot at that elusive second act in American politics when he accidentally shoots himself to death. In a scene that you just have to read, but I will summarize it very briefly. Or should I skip over that? You want to hear
They all want to know.
that? I didn't plan that. Okay. He's involved in a very, very big murder trial, kind of trial that everybody for states around is talking about. And he's a member of a defense dream team. And he has a theory that their client, who was accused of murder, didn't actually shoot the guy who ended up dead, that fella accidentally shot himself to death in a melee. He's on the floor, he's got a gun in his pocket, he's getting up awkwardly, he's not a young man, the gun goes off, shoots him in the abdomen, and he dies. That's the theory. Vallandigham is demonstrating this theory at the Golden Lamb. He's demonstrating this theory at the Golden Lamb in Lebanon because the trial is taking place in Lebanon. And he's talking to his colleagues and he's trying to be realistic. And he puts the gun in his pocket and he gets down on the floor and he's getting up and it's awkward and the gun goes off and it shoots him in exactly the same way he said it happened in this other case, in his abdomen. I won't go into why that gun was loaded. But he doesn't die immediately. He's alert for a couple of hours, but he's mortified. If he hadn't died of the wound, eventually he would have died of embarrassment. Later in that day, the crowd gathers in that room, he dies. And that pretty much ends his political career. But let me end this way, and I am almost done. Vallandigham obsessed with how he would be treated by posterity. Just talked about it all the time, privately and publicly. And insisted that the real measure of a political figure is how history treats him, and insisted that history would understand that he was right and that he stuck to his views under difficult circumstances. And he'd come out okay. Well, I gotta skip one thing here. Sorry. Oh, shoot. That is the nearest street sign to the Vallandigham home in Lisbon, Ohio. The house is actually on US Route 30, otherwise known as the Lincoln Highway. In town, the Lincoln Highway, Route 30 is called Lincoln Way. The address of Vallandigham's, the house Vallandigham grew up in, is on Lincoln Way. An irony I think he might not enjoy. And now I'm done. Thank you very much for your attention.
I hope you all enjoyed hearing this factual story as much as I do. I can't tell you enough how much I appreciate you coming and sharing this with us.
I appreciate it.
And my goal is the next time at the Golden Lamb, Martin tells me there is a room that has the display there. And I've never seen it, and even though I've gone through all the rooms, so I'm gonna have to pay more attention the next time I'm back, but I know some of you need to go because it's late, but if you have some questions, do you want to take them now or?
Sure.
Okay, any questions?
Yes, sir.
What was the idea that he had before he shot himself? What was the idea you were talking about?
Yeah. The idea was referred to as the new departure. And it was that the Democratic Party had to get past Civil War issues, stop fighting about the Civil War and the constitutional amendments that came after the Civil War, to change the subject and to move on. Not to admit error, but to change the subject. The Democrats clearly were not benefiting from having opposed the war. The Republicans were. And this proposal coming from Vallandigham was really quite striking.
Were there any questions on that?
No, it is silent online.
This is a lot to absorb, actually. Go ahead.
How old was he when he died?
51.
51.
So
So are you suggesting that Burnside was actually acting under orders?
no, wasn't an order, but it was murky. And it gets a little complicated, but Burnside had seen an order to some generals to really crack down on political opposition. But that order really referred to the generals in the border states, which Ohio was not. The border states had a lot of Confederates, not just Copperheads, but actual Confederates on the other side, wanting to join the other side. I think that maybe Burnside, not the smartest bulb in the army, not the brightest bulb, not an idiot, misinterpreted that to apply to him. And I also think that his superiors were purposefully vague. I think that, we can't, historians are still arguing about whether Lincoln was for the crackdown on civil liberties that happened to the degree it happened, which was kind of a half-baked degree. And that vagueness seemed to be on purpose. And so there was room for Burnside to go astray. But he was not an idiot, and he thought he was acting within administration policy.
So, and maybe you talk about this book, it struck me that he must have had a lot of attempts made to kill.
Vallandigham?
Yes. Have you had any evidence of that? That he would have been, enemy number one in Georgia.
I don't have anything specific on that. There was, for a long time, he and others were saying he was going to be arrested. He and his people on his side were saying he could be arrested anytime. The army could show up, knock on the door, and just take him away. That was a real concern. He went around with a gun, and I think he had a concern about his personal safety. But I'm not aware of any attempts on it.
I'm wondering why they didn't arrest them when they came to Chicago.
I think by this time they thought he's not the Republicans' problem anymore. Now he's the Democrats' problem as a result of that huge defeat. And Lincoln didn't like these issues to be raised about whether he was transcending the Constitution in putting down some civil liberties. He didn't like that. He was uncomfortable with the whole Vallandigham situation. I didn't have time to get into that. It's clear that he was uncomfortable with it, and he didn't want to, I don't think he wanted to revisit it, and he didn't see any political value in that.
Thank you.
Well, again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.